I'm with David Tuller, investigative reporter and academic coordinator at University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
David, you've been investigating PACE now for a few years. You've described it as fraud, not legally fraud, but deceptive and morally bankrupt piece of research. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay, so I've been very careful not to talk about their motivations, just what they actually did. So basically, they got results and then they didn't provide them. And then they changed all their main outcome measures to get got better results. So, and in those better results, they had 13% of their participants who were already had recovered on one or both of the two primary outcomes. So I would say that that is deceptive because you simply cannot have people who are recovered on your primary outcomes at baseline. It's nonsensical. If they were recovered, why are they in the study to begin with? They've never provided any adequate answer for this. They say, well, we had other outcome measures anyway, so it doesn't matter. You know, all sorts of non-answers to these questions. They also, that would be, to me, a disqualifying factor. One, you can't be recovered at baseline on outcome measures. And two, they hid the fact that 13% of the people were. Those are things that you can't do. So that automatically makes it retractable from my perspective. Another thing that makes it retractable is that they actually did not get informed consent for any of their participants, as far as I can tell. They promised to abide, in their protocol, they promised to abide by the Declaration of Helsinki. That's an international human rights agreement, which is about protecting human subjects. And the Declaration of Helsinki obligates the researchers to let participants of a study know about any possible conflicts of interest they may have. That means any possible conflicts of interest. And if they don't tell any possible conflicts of interest, then they're in violation of their own protocol and they have not obtained informed consent. The main researchers have all been long-standing associates of disability insurance companies, advising them that these particular treatments are the best ways to get people back to work. There's no evidence that this actually is true because PACE provided no evidence that anybody got back to work. In fact, there was no difference. So there's no evidence for this claim, but they still have been making it.
So do you think the association with the insurance company might have influenced the outcome of the trial?
Well, one of the things is you don't actually have to argue whether the influence of insurance companies would change the outcome. All you have to argue is that they didn't do what they said they were going to do, which is disclose their conflicts of interest. If you promise to disclose your conflicts of interest, or in the way it's phrased in the Declaration of Helsinki, any possible conflicts of interest, and you don't disclose them, then you haven't obtained informed consent per your promises, and then you don't actually have informed consent for any of your participants. Therefore, none of the data from the trial should be published. It's all ethically wrong to publish data that they don't have informed consent for. And they say their answers for why they didn't get this informed consent are completely bogus. One of their answers is, well, we told the journal, we told the Lancet, we told Psychological Medicine about our conflicts as we're supposed to do. Well, that's fine. Of course you're supposed to tell them about these potential conflicts of interest, but that doesn't mitigate or take away your responsibility under the Declaration of Helsinki to tell participants as well. The Declaration of Helsinki was created to protect patients. It wasn't created to protect editors or readers of medical journals. It was created to protect participants. So they really have no grounds to stand on. They did not obtain informed consent. They obtained only consent, which was uninformed because they did not tell people of their very serious conflicts of interest. Why is this a conflict of interest? Their interest is in telling disability insurers that they don't have to pay out benefits and that they can have people do a short-term course of a non-pharmaceutical intervention and they should be better. And if they're not better, then they don't want to get better.
Okay.
And that's what happens.
And did you bring this to the attention of the Lancet?
Oh, the Lancet's hopeless.
Yeah, but you wrote to the Lancet?
Yes, the Lancet knows that they have no informed consent, but
Okay.
they don't care apparently.
Okay.
So this has been, it was in the open letters to the Lancet, all contained, the main flaws that are considered retractable flaws. That was one of them.
Okay.
The Lancet doesn't care.
But the Lancet is not going to publish the letter, or it's not going to act
No,
on it?
the Lancet, so after we published an open letter to the Lancet editor solicited a letter for publication, which then they rejected for baseless reasons. So obviously they didn't actually ask us. So they rejected a letter that the editor of the Lancet solicited from 42 very, very busy top professionals and experts at top universities. It's actually shocking. We prepared a letter for publication at some time, with people's input, and the Lancet said refused to run it, even though it had been suggested by the editor. So to us, that meant they never had any intention of publishing it, and it was just a gross way to get us off their backs. My colleague at Columbia, who runs a virology blog, was just shocked that they would solicit a letter and then refuse to publish it.
There was a follow-up paper published in Psychological Medicine which claimed that 22% of patients recovered.
Right.
You also that was.
Well, that also is bogus. So basically, there's two main. There's a lot of papers, but two of the main ones are one is the Lancet in Lancet in 2011 and Psychological Medicine in 2013. The Lancet published data on improvement, but not on recovery, and the 2013 paper was on recovery. So it was separate.
And you wrote to Psychological Medicine also?
Yeah, we've had dealings with Psychological Medicine as all. They also don't think it's a problem.
Okay.
They just say, well, that's, if you have a problem, write your own paper, and they promise to look at reanalyses of the study if people send it to them, but I don't see why anybody would send it to them, because why would you trust them to publish something? We pointed out egregious problems in their findings, in their trial, and they're like, well, isn't that how science is supposed to work? Some people do one thing, and then other people do another one, and then people get to read and figure out which is better. Well, no, science does not proceed by allowing false findings to persist in the literature. These findings are false. The findings, per their original protocol measure of recovery, they had no findings. They made up new findings by changing all their outcome measures, so they got better results. They claim those are the real findings, and the other findings are just, so what that was in our protocol, it doesn't matter.
So you wrote an article in the Journal of Health Psychology recently?
So basically the Journal of Health Psychology last fall commissioned an editorial from an academic, Keith Garrity, who also has ME. And so that triggered upset from them, and they got a response. So they published a response to his concerns, which was also, as usual, nonsensical, their response. Then the journal editor invited like a dozen people to write commentaries, and so mine was one of those, yeah. And there I pointed out that they always basically say that they answer everything, and then they never answer anything.
Correct. And one of their defenses was, well, I think they said it's clear if you apply more stringent criteria, fewer people will recover.
Right.
But
right. So they said, well, of course we understand that in the reanalysis, fewer people will be counted as improved, or another reanalysis is recovered if people use more stringent criteria. Well, of course, as I pointed out, they themselves chose to weaken their stringent criteria for their reporting. So they themselves very well knew, just as anybody would know that if you tighten the criteria, you're going to get worse results. They themselves knew that if you weaken the criteria, you're going to get better results that you can report. So by saying that, they kind of opened themselves up to this criticism that, well, they themselves, of course, knew that they would get better results, which is what they did.
What do you hope to achieve now as you dig deeper and pursue this?
Well, there's just a batch of other things I'd like to keep writing about that are side issues. I'd like the trials, the findings to be retracted, or if they're not retracted, I'd like them to at least be known to be discredited, because retraction rests on the good faith of the journal and the authors, and I don't really have any trust in their good faith at this point. They've been behaved in bad faith all along. So if they won't get retracted, I certainly would like to see them discredited, which I think they're in the process of being. Sure. I think the PACE paradigm is in the process of falling apart.
There is another researcher, Esther Crawley, and
yes.
I think she tried to discredit you recently.
Well, I don't know what she thought she was doing, but she gave a talk about anti-science people who were campaigning supposedly against her and her colleagues. She's very close buddies with the PACE authors, has worked with them. They all peer review each other's things. So she's equally, her work has similar problems. She manages to conflate chronic fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome constantly in her research. And so it's hard to tell what she's studying or who she's studying. She claims to be studying ME/CFS, but it's clear a lot of the patients probably don't have it. Okay? So she basically gave a talk 2 weeks ago about anti-science, where she was posting things about all the people attacking her, and among their tactics that she listed was, like in a list on a slide of several things, there was written libelous blogs. So then there was a screenshot of one of my blogs. So unless as I said, unless I'm mistaken, and she was using my blog as an example of a way not to write a libelous blog, which I doubt very much she was doing, I made the obvious assumption that she was using my blog as an example of libelous blogs. And so basically she has accused me and my colleague, Dr. Raccaniello at Columbia, of libel. So that's a very serious charge. As I pointed out over and over in numerous posts and in my emails directly to her, which she doesn't respond to, Dr. Crawley, I'm still interested in hearing your explanation for your very serious charge. Can you point to my libelous blogs or the libelous things that I said, and I'll correct them if they're mistaken. So, the thing is, she can't distinguish, it seems, between opinions she dislikes, which is that I wrote about her work unfavorably, and libel. And I wrote harshly about her work because it's bad, but there's not a libelous word in the group. It's all accurate description, and the parts that she doesn't like are my opinions. So, she can't go around, she can go around calling people libelous if she wants to, but it's not a good thing to do, and it puts her in some legal jeopardy, because she's making false public accusations about me that probably, are actionable. I'm not going to sue, okay, but I probably could.
But it must be bringing her reputation and perhaps her university's reputation, the University of Bristol, into disrepute if she's making these claims.
Well, I don't know why she's making it. I don't know what she's thinking. I haven't talked to her.
Have you attempted to communicate with her?
Yes, I've emailed her half a dozen times. I email them when I have a new thing posted. I know they won't get back to me, but I don't see any. I say, hi, just thought you might be interested in my latest thing about your research. I know that they hate me, or that they probably want me to hang from the rafters, with hot pokers sticking in my eyes. But, I see no reason why I shouldn't send them polite messages about what I'm doing.
Very good.
And I really, for my own purposes, I need to ask them whether they have any comment. I've written her several times and said, Dr. Crawley, I have another blog post coming out. If you'd like to include either your explanation for your charge, the documentation backing it up, or an apology, I'd be happy to include that. But I never hear from her.
And of course, Esther Crawley is involved with the CFS ME Research Collaborative, the CMRC in the UK.
So a lot of patients are very unhappy with the collaborative. There's some speculation that it was set up basically to be, Esther Crawley's baby, and she's the vice chair, and I've basically insisted that they need to take a stand on their vice chair being abusive. But they haven't. I mean, they have taken a stand. They say she has our support. They haven't taken a position on whether she's accurate. But I take their position to mean that they think she's accurate. I'm interpreting it that way.
You were in communication with Stephen Holgate, I believe. Is that correct?
He responded to one of my emails or two.
Did he inadvertently reply to one of the emails?
Oh, he inadvertently did, I think, a reply all, and it didn't come back to me, but it went to Vincent, where I had sent a note saying, hey, another note saying, I forget which note it was, this is what I'm posting. And he sent an email back, which Vincent then forwarded to me, and it said, I hope you don't feel you need to respond to this. So I assumed it was a mistake, and I wrote him and I said, hi, Vincent got this email. I assume it was by mistake, unless you really, wanted to explain this. And then he got back to me. So he hadn't gotten back to me before, but he got back to me after he realized I had a copy of his note where he told his fellow researchers of the board that they should not bother to answer my questions. And then I guess he felt he needed to get back to me, at which point he said, we have no official standing. We don't have any, we're nothing. We would have no reason to take a position. At which point I wrote back and I said, that's kind of silly. What does that mean? You're not official to who? You're meeting, you have a board, you have members. I mean, I'm not sure what's not official about it that makes it impossible to take a stand. So I wrote that. And then finally, he did take a stand in support of her and said she had the full support of the board, although a few days later, one of the groups that was part of the organization dropped out. So obviously, she didn't have the full support of the board. So he gave me a half lie, so then I did a blog post about that. So basically, what I've come to realize is that I don't know if it's effective, but they're not really used to someone like me, I think. I don't owe them any deference. I don't have any respect for them, and I don't owe them any. And they seem to think that I'm rude, which I am, and obnoxious, which I can be. But I seem that's the only way to deal with them, because being polite doesn't get anywhere.
Are you surprised that some of the charities are still involved in the CMRC?
Well, charities are businesses, and they do what's useful for them for the money. I think they have different motivations, and I think there generally is important to sort of have somebody talking with them, keeping an eye on what they're doing, being kind of a watchdog. So I think it's useful to have that function. On the other hand, there's always a point at which organizations have to decide, are they going to work from within or from without? And at some point, when people give up on the organization working from within, they work without. So ME Research UK has decided they don't want to work with them any longer, and they're dropping out. ME Association still thinks, it seems up until now, they still think they can work with them. And Action for ME is very much of them. I mean, they are, very supportive, and still are very supportive, as I heard from Sonia Chowdhury recently.
But Action for Me refused to, were they asked to sign your letter, or did they refuse to sign your letter?
Right, and they were said that they weren't asked before, which was true. They were asked after the fact. I don't think that's a really good reason not to sign it. I think to say also they know it's ridiculous to say, well, they've already refused to retract it, so it would have no impact. They know very well that I don't think anybody who signed the letter, I can speak for myself, I didn't expect it to force a retraction. I expected it to put pressure and highlight the problems that psychological medicine has in dealing with the issue. And it did that very well. I think that it would have added to that weight had Action for ME decided after the fact to sign it. And they know very well, I think, that it would have added to the weight of the letter. I don't think the fact that they didn't retract it, I don't agree with Action for ME's argument that, oh, well, then it doesn't make any difference whether we would sign it. That's just a bogus argument.
So do you think Action for Me really have patients' best interests at heart? Or do you think they're being influenced by maybe previous?
I don't know what they think. I don't know what they think about.
But do you find it strange that they wouldn't sign the letter?
You know, organizations need to do what they feel they need to do, and I'm interested in the science and some of the politics between the groups. I'm American, so some of the UK politics between the groups, I feel like it doesn't feel exactly like I can talk about how I feel like they should behave in relation to me, or, I do feel that people who work with Esther Crawley have an obligation to say, well, we don't agree that David Tuller is libeling her, and to the extent that they're not doing that, that's a problem. Whether they should pull out, that's up to them. I can talk about the things that I feel I'm owed, I have a right to expect that no matter how obnoxious I am, I will not be have false charges made against me, and I have a right to expect that those who work with the people making false charges will say publicly, "Hey, that's not right." From what I've made clear is that I interpret anybody not doing that as endorsing her claim. So right now, Action for ME, from my perspective, has essentially endorsed Esther's claim that I libeled her, even though I don't think they really do believe it, but they haven't publicly contradicted her. And I think they have an obligation to.
Do you get the impression it's a small group of highly organized researchers hell-bent on sticking to their agenda in spite of all the scientific evidence?
I think it's a small group of researchers who all read each other's work and support each other's work and peer review each other's work, and have built careers on this nonsense, and don't really see a way out of
That's
of
right.
it.
Because if this comes crashing down, their careers are essentially over. Would that be correct?
This was their careers before they did the PACE trial. The PACE was supposed to be the crowning achievement that was going to ratify what they've been doing all this time, and it failed. And so I understand that they're desperate to hang on to this rich income stream of support and disability insurance payments, and companies, and contracts, and more research. Every time there's more research on CBT and GET to find out, even if at the best it only worked in 22% of the people, even if you give them that their flawed study actually means something, which it doesn't, that's terrible. So then they're finding out then they're doing studies, why doesn't it work for more people? They're always trying to find it, but it doesn't work. The study proved it doesn't work. Even at their best, it would work for a few people if you believe their results, which I don't.
And it's important to mention the follow-up paper to the PACE concluded that there was little difference between treatment arms.
Right, so they make a ridiculous argument, and this always seems to happen with these treatments, that at follow-up 2 years later or something, all the groups are equal. Now, they did something very strange in their Lancet Psychiatry paper about that. You're doing a randomized trial. Your valid comparisons are between the groups. Your comparisons within the groups that's not what you're studying. A trial is to study how different groups perform under circumstances. So it's sort of scientifically incoherent for them they published that study, and the operative finding was, hey, after 2.5 years or 2 years, all the groups perform equally well or badly, whichever you think it is. In other words, the cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy group had their average went up more quickly and then plateaued. The other groups went up more slowly, but they reached more or less the same point. So their answer was, well, look at these great gains were sustained after 2 years. That's not the result. The result is that, everybody catches up. That's the valid result from what they did. Now, they departed from that in the way they reported it, and the way they reported it was just utterly stupid. And unfortunately for them, that paper came out a week after my initial series came out. So the initial reporting about that paper was combined with reporting about questions about the PACE trial. And so that didn't get the kind of unqualified good press that previous trials had gotten.
Right. And talk to me about the Cochrane Review for a minute. The Cochrane Review is often considered the Bible of reviews in terms of nobody questions it. But
so Cochrane Review is only as good as the studies it reviews. So a Cochrane Review can only, if all the reviews that it's studying on an issue are terrible, then the review is going to be terrible because it's not going to have good data. The problem with the Cochrane Reviews is that one, this whole domain's in the this whole thing was set up with the support of these people in Cochrane, as I understand it. And I have to do more looking into that. But as I understand it, some of the same people were involved. It's in the mental health section in Cochrane, so most of the people reviewing studies are psychiatrists. I don't understand why that is. That's only because they bought into the mentality of the biopsychosocial group. So it shouldn't be in the mental health section, and these studies should not be being reviewed by psychiatrists, except the studies that they do are all by psychiatrists, mainly because those are the ones studying CBT and GET. The problem with the Cochrane reviews is that a lot of the studies, like PACE, use criteria that are very nonspecific. So use the Oxford criteria that's more common in the UK, which means people are diagnosed with 6 months of fatigue, but no required other symptoms. So 6 months of fatigue is a proxy for a lot of different illnesses. And so there's a lot of things that might be unexplained, but you may not have chronic fatigue syndrome, you may have something else. And so if you look at the PACE trial, where a lot of the people half the people, or 40-something%, had clinical signs of depression, you don't really know, are you treating their depression? Maybe that's their main problem. Or are you treating their are you treating their chronic fatigue syndrome? So, you don't really know when you do studies and you have a very non-specific case definition who you're studying, what the mechanism is. So Cochrane throws all these studies with bad case definitions in, and PACE is by far the largest, so it's going to dominate the results. So if you're going to look and see if exercise is good, you look at PACE, you're going to see a little thing about exercise is good, and it'll seem like when you review it that it's positive.
David, you mentioned earlier that your colleagues in America find it difficult to understand this situation. Do you think there's a complete difference of opinion in the mentality of some of these researchers between the UK and the US?
Yeah, I think some of the researchers in the US actually think there's a serious illness going on that they need to figure out. Except for a couple of people in the UK, that doesn't seem to be the general rule. Now, the PACE authors now say, oh, we've always said there's biology and whatever, but they're not talking about biology. They're talking about physical deconditioning, which of course has its own biology. So everything is biology. To say that we're talking about biology is silly. The question is, what is actually causing the illness? And if you look at the PACE trial in the Lancet, the descriptions of CBT and GET are very clear, that they do not presume any underlying organic pathology. All they presume is deconditioning from a false illness belief that you can't do exercise because you're too sick. So, the whole enterprise is so fraught with missteps that it's all meaningless.
Sense About Science in the US wrote an editorial about your work, very praising of your work. Sense About Science in the UK seem to be quieter on this.
Okay, so I don't know. So Sense About Science in the US supports stats.org, which is what published that piece. Then Sense About Science UK got upset and started, I guess, I don't really know what the connection between those two entities is. There's some connection, but obviously they're free to take different tacks.
Okay, so you notice a difference between both entities in the response?
Yeah, I know that there's a difference between them because Sense About Science UK has been in the bed of the PACE people in the Science Media Center and all that. That's not the case in the US, and so I don't know how that difference arose.
Do you think it might have anything to do with Simon Wesley?
Think what?
Simon Wesley, he's on the board.
Yeah, about Simon?
Yeah. Do you think that he has influenced
I'm sure Simon influences everything. So he's on the, he was one of the founders of the Science Media Center. I'm sure he was involved probably in setting up the Cochrane thing with ME. He's involved in all of it, and he's playing his role behind the scenes, and I'm sure furiously, scrambling to try to maintain the PACE paradigm. But again, his answers, like the answers of the PACE authors, are incoherent. They don't make any sense.
So Simon Wesley, in a recent blog online, he compared a trial to a voyage across the sea. He said it's necessary to make adjustments as you go along in order to reach your destination. Isn't that the opposite of what a trial should be?
Well, yeah, I think Steve Lubit in one of his blog posts pointed out that the metaphor suggests that they had a set destination to get to New York, and then you change your thing just to make sure you get to New York. And I think Stephen was exactly right. You don't make your adjustments during the trial so you get to a particular destination. You go out there and you have the rules of the trial, and then you see where you get. Now, there's no excuse for a protocol. They spent a lot of time on that protocol. And they had committees and other people looking at it. You can't, after the fact, they came up with reasons why the protocol measures were problematic. And I'm like, well, you should have thought of that before you put them in your protocol. It's just not done what they did. People make changes in their outcome measures, but they don't refuse to present their original measures the way they have. And then they don't charge patient harassment when patients legitimately file freedom of information requests to see what the results are. It's unconscionable. You got money, you got your £5 million based on what you promised to do. If you change what you promised to do, you shouldn't be surprised that people are upset. Why shouldn't they be? They claim, oh, well, we didn't look at any of we made the changes before we saw the outcome measures. Well, but all your changes were made in ways that would show better results. You don't need to look at the outcome measures to know that if you redefine tall as 5'6" from 5'8", you're going to get more tall people in your group because you've redefined it lower. If you redefine everything lower, you're going to get more better results. You don't need to look at the results to find out what they're going to be to know that your results are going to be better. You can't redefine things so that you can make them lower than the entry requirements. You just can't do that. If you do that, your trial is ridiculous.
And I think he justified some of the changes because it gave them results which were congruent with previous trials.
Oh, that's ridiculous too. So they used the previous trials. We've done these early trials, show some evidence. Now we need to do a big trial which will prove that they're all true. Now the big trial proves to be a bust. So you're using the manipulated results from your big trial to justify, to say, oh, well, our earlier trial showed the same things, we're on the right track. You're not doing a big trial to ratify everything you did. You're doing a big trial to find out whether those early findings are true. If you find out they're not true, you can't change your findings to go back and make them similar to your previous findings. It's astonishing that they would say something like that. Not evidence that your findings are true, that's evidence that you manipulated your findings to get the point that you wanted to reach.
Ben Goldacre said in The Guardian, "You cannot change the rules after you've started. You cannot even be seen to do that." And he also said data belongs to the patients and to the people whose bodies are used.
Well, so again, Ben Goldacre trained with Wesley, so he's very good on these things, but totally not there when it comes to PACE. He won't say anything about PACE because he obviously knows it's a horrible trial, but he's in bed with or close to, apparently Simon Wesley. So I don't have a lot of, in my mind, he's kind of a hypocrite.
Right. I mean, he seems to say the right things, but he's been silent on PACE.
Well, I mean, everything that he says, they've done in PACE. Exactly. So he doesn't seem to want to apply it to PACE, though. And it's sort of, it's not responsible of him to say, well, I'm just not looking at every trial. I'm only going to look at some trials. I mean, this is a big trial.
I get the impression people are afraid to be too critical.
I don't know that people are afraid. I think they just don't. I think most people, if they didn't really look at the stuff, why wouldn't they believe the doctors and the psychiatrists and the establishment are telling them one thing? And patients who sort of look crazy from the outside, well, why are they arguing against the Lancet? The Lancet's a good journal. Why are they arguing? It doesn't make a lot of sense from the outsider's perspective. Why are these patients agitating? And the framing of the PACE authors, which is, well, that they just don't want to admit that they have psychiatric issues, possibly, or that some psychological help, something could help. That's so ridiculous because that's not what patients are objecting to. But it looks like that's what they're objecting to if you frame it that way. So I think a lot of people outside just have no idea and aren't paying attention to it.
Okay. And in the letters you wrote, there seemed to be a lot fewer signatories from the UK than from the US. Is that just because you asked fewer people in the UK to sign your letters, or?
Oh, the open letters?
Yeah.
Well, I think in the UK, look, I think in the US there's a lot more heterogeneity of opinion about this, and I think there's a lot more in the US who accept that it's an actual physical illness, and there's a lot more doctors. You know, we have a different healthcare system. We're not all under one system, so that has bad things and it has good things. It means that if I don't like my doctor in my neighborhood, I can go to a doctor in 3 towns over or in the next state if I want to, and my insurance most likely will pay if I have insurance. We have other problems like we don't have insurance. But if you have insurance, it mostly will pay. So people have options, and doctors have independent power centers in a way that they don't quite have in the UK. You know, I think I'm in the US, I'm American. I and some of the patient groups have more contact with the US doctors. And again, some of the UK ones, they don't want to sign because even if they don't agree with the PACE people, they have to rely on this for grant funding and so on and so forth. And the system is completely behind the PACE people.
Thanks for your time, David.
Yeah, thank you.